had people ask about. All right. Welcome everyone virtually. My name is Rachel Helvering and I'm in community engagement at the Tennessee State Museum. And we are thrilled that you're joining us virtually for book club tonight. I hope everybody was able to log on. We had some issues ourselves even getting on. So thank you for bearing with our WebEx and getting in here. Tonight, we're so excited for our book club choice this month. If you've been following along this year, you know that our curators have been selecting titles. We have our senior curator of military history, Lisa Boudreau, which hopefully you can see her up there. She is going to be helping with the discussion tonight, and this is her book choice, so hopefully you've had a chance to read it. And we are also so excited to be joined by the author. So we're going to kick it off with a little bit of an author talk, but before we do, I want to make sure that you guys know where the features are in WebEx. So if you go to the bottom of your screen, for most of us, there's a mute button. Make sure you're muted. You will see a little X through your microphone. As long as you're muted, you'll know. And then there should be a little chat bubble kind of over to the bottom right. You hit the chat. That is how you can ask us questions. If you have any technical problems, please ask us. Or if you want to ask Lisa or Ed any questions, you can do that there. Just make sure you choose all panelists. There's a little drop-down menu. Choose all panelists, and then we'll all see your questions. So there will be a time for questions for them at the end. Please be thinking about them. And if in the meantime you have any issues, send us a message and we'll see if we can help you. But to get started, I don't want to go too long with the logistics. We do have our wonderful senior curator, Dr. Lisa Boudreau. She's an author of a couple books. She's a contributor to various publications. She is our in-house guru. We're thrilled to have her tonight. And then we have Ed Lengal. He is with the National World War II Museum. Obviously, he wrote the book that we're talking about this evening, received his PhD from the University of Virginia, and we are just thrilled to have him. So without further ado, Ed, if you want to take it away, go ahead.
Thank you, Rachel, and I want to start out by thanking my friend Lisa Budreau, and thanks again to you too, Rachel, for the invitation, for setting up this great event. It's my honor to be here. Tennessee history is important to me. My mom's family, going all the way back, came from Fentress County and Scott Counties, Tennessee, right up along the border there, and from Clinton County, Wayne County, Kentucky, which is how on my mom's side, I'm related to Alvin York. So this is something, having spent a great deal of time there as a child and getting to know the really unique culture, the very special culture of the people of the Upper Cumberland, makes Alvin York's story, which is part of this story, really, really meaningful to me. So I'm glad for any opportunity to talk about it. I have been with the National World War II Museum. I'm currently the chief historian of the National Medal of Honor Museum in Arlington, Texas, which is in the process of development and will be opened in 2024. So, but this evening, without further ado, I'm going to be talking about 3 Medal of Honor recipients in the context of the larger story of the Great War's Lost Battalion. Those Medal of Honor recipients being Alvin York, Charles Whittlesey, and George Mcmurtry, and along with one intrepid newspaper reporter, Damon Runyon, who became part of their story. The story of the doughboys of World War I think everybody realizes by now, as we've passed the centennial, remains underappreciated and misunderstood in our culture, in our society. It's gotten a bit better in recent years, thanks to the work of people like Lisa and my colleagues who've been working in this field to kind of bring it back to the forefront of our memory. But it's still widely misunderstood, and I think it's very important, remains very important, will be so, to try to recover the stories of the doughboys and try to understand who they were and how they contributed to our society. But my story begins in New York City in 1917, which was not really the New York that we think of today. New York at that time, although today we think of New York as kind of symbolizing America and everything that is American, New York at that time was viewed by many Americans as being kind of a foreign entity, something different, something incomprehensible, really, that had entered into our country. We didn't really understand what the city represented, and particularly who the people were, and what their role might be in our country in the 20th century. The massive wave of immigration that changed American society so much in the late 19th, early 20th centuries from places like Central and Eastern Europe, and even from Asia and Scandinavia and places like that, had introduced new and really complex elements into our society. Nowhere more true than in New York City, where if you walked through certain neighborhoods, you would hear a babble of different languages, different smells, foods, cultures, religions, everything else. And there was a great deal of suspicion in the United States and in the media as well in 1917, as the United States entered World War I, what attitude people like these were going to have toward their new country. Were they going to support the country in its time of crisis? Were they going to remain loyal to their own former countries, which included places like Germany and Austria-Hungary that we were now at war with? What was their role going to be? Shortly before the United States entered World War I, something called the Plattsburgh Movement developed, and this was named after its initial camp in Plattsburgh in upstate New York. Teddy Roosevelt was one of its instigators. And the idea was that America's most privileged young men, most privileged citizens, the sons of bankers and lawyers and the blue bloods, so to speak, had a duty to serve their country and had a duty to learn physical fitness, had a duty to learn military philosophy, military ideas, and be prepared to serve their country in time of crisis. There was an anticipation from Roosevelt, at least, and some others, that the United States was bound to enter this war. And the responsibility to lead people like this was to fall into the hands of people like this, who would need to train in peacetime and be prepared when the country entered the war to take the lead of very, very diverse units that would be formed of draftees, and to meld them into a whole and teach them patriotism, teach them values, teach them togetherness. Two of the men who joined up in the Plattsburgh Movement and then became officers as the United States entered World War I were, as you see here on the left, Charles Whittlesey, and on the right, George Mcmurtry, who are two of the central characters in our story this evening. Charles Whittlesey was from a family that originally came from Wisconsin and then moved to Pittsfield, Massachusetts. He was very privileged. He graduated from Williams College, then went on to Harvard Law School, and by the time World War I begins, is in a thriving legal practice in New York City, in Manhattan. He's an intellectual. He is a very sensitive individual. But he's also somebody who has this profound sense of duty and noblesse oblige that was taught to him in the Plattsburgh camps. And so when the United States enters the war, he does not hesitate to sign up and to become an officer. George Mcmurtry, who you see on the right, had served in the Spanish-American War. He was in his 40s. He was a millionaire stockbroker in New York City. Nobody would have told him that he had an obligation to serve, because he already had served, but he felt that he needed to do more for his country. He felt he had an obligation, again, as somebody who was among the best and brightest, to continue to lead and to continue to serve. Both of these individuals, Whittlesey and Mcmurtry, are assigned as officers in the 308th Infantry Regiment of the 77th Division, New York's own, the Metropolitan Division, that is forged out of draftees from greater New York City, many of these immigrants that I had spoken about, and it's going to be their duty to meld them into a cohesive unit and bring them into action in the fields of France and the Force of the Argonne in 1918. This is going to be the very first all-draftee division in United States history, let alone World War I, that's going to enter into full-scale modern combat as an all-draftee division. Meanwhile, different parts of the country, very different parts of the country from New York City, are also bringing Americans from different backgrounds into the military, into kind of this national effort for the first time. And there are many forms of otherness. There are many forms of foreignness in our country. And one form is what we just saw in New York City, but another form is people from places like this. This is Fentress County, Tennessee. A later picture, obviously, as you see the automobile in the background, but it reflects some of the rural poverty that characterized this part of the country in the Upper Cumberlands. No part of the United States was more isolated in the continental United States than Fentress County and this area of Tennessee. As my mom used to say, it wasn't until the Tennessee Valley Authority really opened the region up that these people kind of integrated into mainstream American life. Very few people visited from outside, and people who grew up there generally never left. And Alvin York, who was born in 1887, being one of those in East Tennessee, was certainly one of those. He is drafted. We all know, I think, the story from the movie Sergeant York that portrays in a very kind of Hollywood version of York's journey toward acceptance of military service. I don't need to repeat it here because the cliche is so well known that he was a man of God and a man of faith who believed in the Bible and wasn't sure that that God really would permit him to serve and to potentially kill another man in the line of duty. York's story is much more complex than that. And when I look at Alvin York's background in Fentress County, and I kind of put it in the context of what I know about those people, I think that it helps to expose the complexities of the man. Alvin York grew up not only in what mainstream Americans would call poverty, although his family were reasonably well off farmers, but in isolation. But he grew up on the tougher side of these communities. There are great divisions between the church-going communities in these regions, but also between the kind of the opposite, the young men in particular who didn't go to church, who went to what's called blind tigers, where they would go and drink illegally, get in fights, became very comfortable with violence, with drunkenness, with kind of the extremes of life. This is a region where the people are very, very comfortable and very understanding of what violence is all about, experienced it as part of their everyday lives. York, in embracing his faith as he did as a young man, was, I think, trying to escape from that legacy of violence. He was trying to escape from that legacy of poverty. And I think that, and this is something we can talk about more in Q&A, I think his primary fear in entering into military service was, yes, kind of philosophically whether he would be permitted to kill, but I think it was also a fear of what was in himself, a fear that under fire and in combat, as the story eventually will develop, that a switch will turn in him and he will become who he was. He will become a cold-blooded individual who was very comfortable with violence and potentially a killer as well, because he had seen men die in fights in Fentress County. He didn't want to go back there again, and he was afraid that would happen. So an army of up to 4 million young men who are sent to Europe from all different backgrounds. We've seen a few of those backgrounds today, and melded into a whole, theoretically, by General John Blackjack Pershing, who you see here in the front left. Pershing, and I don't have time to go into the details here, Pershing was a believer in American exceptionalism. He was a believer that Americans were superior to other peoples of the planet, and superior to Europeans as well. And he thought that employing a specifically American style of combat on the front in action would allow the Americans to have a decisive role on the Western Front, which had been stuck in trench warfare for such a long time. He thought that Europeans had become corrupted and demoralized by their experiences in the trenches, and he thought that Americans would be able to break out of that by getting out of the trenches and attacking and attacking and attacking and fighting in the open and relying on their own individual initiative and their rifles and bayonets to impose their will upon the enemy. This is a philosophy that plays itself out on the Western Front as Americans begin to enter combat at the end of May 1918, and then at places like Belleau Wood at the beginning of June, where the Marines as well as the Army enter into the first major modern battle in American history with extremely heavy casualties. And then the United States First Army, as it's eventually formed, entering into combat in the Meuse-Argonne offensive that begins on September 26, 1918. This is something that has shockingly to me faded from our memory as Americans. I'll just say, if you go to see the Smithsonian's National Museum of American History in Washington, D.C., and you look at their galleries of American military history, and you look at the small corner they have on World War I, that exhibit does not even mention the Meuse-Argonne, in which 26,000 young men were killed in action, most of them, the vast majority of them, in the first 3 weeks. And over 100,000 additional casualties. So you're talking about over half the number of total combat casualties in the whole Korean War taking place within 3 weeks. And this is something that is largely forgotten today. And yet into this maelstrom, the 77th Division and also Alvin York's 82nd Division will be thrown and will experience their crucible of combat. Without going into too many details about the offensive as a whole, let's just focus in on the story very quickly of the Lost Battalion and of the experiences of these men. The 77th Division, in which, as I said, Major now Charles Whittlesey, Captain George Mcmurtry, are thrown with their 308th Regiment, is ordered to attack into the Argonne Forest, as you see an example of it here. The Argonne Forest was extremely heavily fortified. The German troops holding this forest were veteran troops, well commanded, very well motivated, and heavily dug in, who understand forest fighting. The ground is not just forested, but it's also very rugged. You can see it today. It's characterized by ravines and rocky areas and steep slopes, and very tough terrain. Whittlesey's division will be thrown into the Argonne Forest in attacks from September 26 onward, over and over and over again. Even when other American divisions are relieved from the front, the 77th, this all-draftee division, is the one division that remains in line and is told to attack into these woods again and again and again, with really devastating results. But the fascinating thing is that this division, being so heavily made up of immigrants, never falters, never fails to continue its assault. That's partly a credit to its leadership, but also the dedication of the men who were fighting. On October 2nd, Whittlesey is ordered to assault with a combined force of 2 battalions, 1st and 2nd battalions of the 308th Regiment, into the Argonne. Whittlesey protests against the order. He is ordered to go in anyway. He is told, don't worry about your flanks. If you don't see anybody on your flanks, don't worry, you will be supported. Your job is to take your objective. Whittlesey launches the assault and pushes forward into the woods, takes ground on his objective because a gap has opened in the German lines. Shockingly, he doesn't get any real opposition right away. Builds a perimeter for his approximately 600 men on the far edge of a ravine, digs in, and discovers that, in fact, there is nobody on either flank. And that night, the Germans close in, surround him, and isolate what came to be called the Lost Battalion. The Lost Battalion was a name given by an editor in the United States who was writing to one of his journalists. Once the journalists at the front found out about it, saying, send more on Lost Battalion. That was something the media picked up on later. It's not really what they called it at the time. So their Golgotha begins from this point of 5 days in the forest. You can walk this ground now. It's very striking, very shocking, actually. And they have no food whatsoever. They didn't get anything to eat before they went in. They have no rations with them. They have no medical supplies. They have no water beyond what's in their canteens and beyond what they can get from a spring at the bottom of the slope that is under enemy sniper observation. So it's a really rough situation. Now, trying to compress this incredibly dramatic story into a nutshell, the fascinating thing about it, and this picture you see here is a still from the 1919 silent movie, The Lost Battalion, which is a tragic story in its own right, in which many veterans of the Lost Battalion were sent back to the battlefield and told to reenact what they had experienced. So the men you see here are actual Lost Battalion veterans reenacting what they experienced in the pocket. Fascinating thing about it is that you have all these men from greater New York City, as well as a draft of replacements from the western plain states and the mountain states, who are kind of forced into the division shortly before it goes into action. Guys who had nothing in common with each other, guys who would, before the war, as soon as beaten each other up, as help each other out, become absolutely dependent upon each other and become comrades in the truest sense, utterly reliant on each other, willing to die for each other. When a man gets wounded, his buddies will go down and risk enemy fire to get water from that spring and often end up casualties themselves. But it's a tremendous story of what is the core of the combat veterans' experience and their reliance on each other. The other part of the story is the leadership. Whittlesey, being a man who was not a natural military man, who had no interest really or affinity for military service, but felt a definite sense of obligation and responsibility, feels utter, complete, and total responsibility and devotion to his men, and stays there with them and never sleeps the whole time that they're in this pocket, crawling from shell hole to shell hole, trying to buck up the men, trying to keep the perimeter intact in his own really kind of amateurish way, but totally earnest way, in a way that's inspiring for them, but also incredibly traumatic for him. He crawls, for example, into one foxhole. They called them funk holes at the time, with a mortally wounded private, trying to kind of keep him close and to keep him feeling secure through the night, to give him comfort. And then Whittlesey nods off briefly, and when he wakes up, he finds the private dead, leaning against his cheek. These are things that he will never forget. But the main story here is that and I've spoken with many veterans about this, and it characterizes Whittlesey as a Medal of Honor recipient, where Whittlesey's superiors all during this period were all saying, "I'm not responsible. This isn't my fault. Don't blame me. Look somewhere else. If this goes bad, it's somebody else's fault." Whittlesey and Mcmurtry, who is his rock in the pocket, both say, "I take responsibility. I'm not interested in fault or blame right now. This is my job. I have total and complete responsibility right now." That seems to me to be the essence of leadership. The Lost Battalion lingers for a number of days in the pocket, and the 77th Division attacks over and over to try to liberate them, fails. Their situation is getting worse and worse. This is becoming known to the press, and General Hunter Liggett comes up with an idea to launch two divisions, the 28th Division, the Pennsylvania National Guard Keystone Division, and the 82nd All-American Division, of which Alvin York, as you see here, is a member, into the German flank some distance to the north of where the Lost Battalion is beleaguered, into the Germans' left flank, and to push into the forest and to force the Germans to pull back and uncover the Lost Battalion. Alvin York here goes into combat for the first time, a short distance from where the Lost Battalion is fighting. And this is certainly something I think we're going to talk about Lisa shortly, about where this actually happened, which has become controversial. There's also some debate. Now, there have been a number of books coming out about Alvin York. One of them, James Carl Nelson's The York Patrol, came out earlier this year. And I know my colleague James Gregory from Oklahoma has an important new book coming out next year that looks deeply into Alvin York's action, examining exactly what happened and whether York deserves the full credit for what he did, or really rather he should share that credit with others. I'm not going to get into the details of that right now, but looking at what was my primary interest of York's mentality, when York comes under fire, he moves into the forest with his patrol. He has captured a number with his comrades, a number of German prisoners. A German machine gun and other German forces open fire on that group, and York is thrust into combat. Examining what sources we have, which are fairly limited, of how York responded, you see that switch does indeed turn in his head, and he becomes that hardened East Tennessee mountain fighter, something that his ancestors had carried with him, something he had learned as a youth, something he had seen, and he becomes, in fact, I think, a cold-blooded killer. If you follow his action, you see the coldness with which he shot down Germans, eventually plays a critical role in breaking up the German attack, and then with his comrades in capturing what's eventually tallied at 132 German prisoners. There are episodes here where York is just stone cold. When German Lieutenant Vollmer surrenders to York, after seeing many of his men killed, York just holds a pistol to his head and says, "You'd better," with just a blank face. After the surrender, two Germans, one of whom is just a boy, attempt to play hero and to throw a grenade at York, or attempt to break up the American party. York shoots him point blank in the head, stone cold. Afterward, he realizes what has happened and what he has done, and as the story goes, ridden by guilt, he takes stretcher bearers back down to the site of the battlefield, just screaming out and crying. It's one of the most poignant moments that I've seen in the whole story of the Argonne Offensive, looking for a survivor anywhere. He is racked by survivor's guilt. He is racked by trauma. There's no doubt about it in my mind. But as our story continues we see that he dealt with it in a different way from some others. Damon Runyon, I don't have time to talk much about him, but he enters into my story here briefly. A great sports writer, very devoted to the 77th Division, follows the division to the front, crawls into shell holes at just a short distance behind the front, and is the first to interview the Lost Battalion when it is in fact liberated, thanks in large part to the action of York's division. Damon Runyon interviews Whittlesey, Mcmurtry, and reports on what they did back to the United States. This is a guy who writes Guys and Dolls later on, and writes so much, so poignantly on the life of New York City. He's the one who really brings their tale to life and brings it to everyday Americans. But now to wrap things up, as the men return home, Whittlesey, Mcmurtry, York, and of course others will all eventually receive the Medal of Honor, some sooner, some later, but they're all carrying with them the burden of what they've experienced. This picture of George Mcmurtry, to me, just speaks volumes, because really all you have to do is look at his face. This is George Mcmurtry returning home on the ship that brought him back to the United States. And you can see he's been severely wounded. He's shown incredible dedication, but he is deeply scarred by what he's experienced. It's said that when he returned home, his personality had totally changed from what he had been before. Charles Whittlesey is tormented by nightmares, is tormented by tremendous guilt. There is controversy over York's action. There was also controversy over Whittlesey's action. Some of family members and some of the men he was with blamed him for getting the men into this mess. And he feels that blame. He feels a tremendous sense of guilt. To me, is as shocking for a man who gave everything he had, everything that he had, to the limit of his knowledge and ability, feels the loss of every single man, as only a third of the men who walked in were able to walk out. He feels the blame for every single man who died, as well as the men who died trying to rescue the Lost Battalion. One of his friends is a baseball pitcher, professional Major League Baseball pitcher, Eddie Grant, is killed trying to rescue Whittlesey. And Whittlesey says, this is my fault, deep down, and feels that returning home. Alvin York, too, although he's treated as a celebrity, if you look at pictures of him, and I think this is one example in his more unguarded moments, you see something of what he's carrying, the burden that he's carrying, something that didn't come out in the kind of sappy biographies, largely fictionalized biographies by people like Tom Scahill that came out after the war. Don't get into the depth of what he's feeling, because he knows what he's done, and he feels it. If you read, it's interesting, if you read interviews with York as he's going through all of these things in New York City and places where they're treating him like a hero, at his more unguarded moments, he shows a little bit of what's in himself. And at one point, somebody interviews him about what it was like to fight, and he references to hearing Germans squeal like pigs when they were stuck with bayonets. And there's something very elemental and basic in that. I hear a voice of York, of a pre-war York, who is like, yeah, kill him. But he's struggling deeply with that faith that he's trying to cling to maintain his life and his hope for the future. Their story comes together at the what we're going to mark the centennial of this year, 100th anniversary of the internment of the unknown soldier, November of 1921, in Arlington National Cemetery in Virginia. Whittlesey, York, and Mcmurtry are all there, witness the ceremony. Whittlesey is incredibly traumatized by seeing this casket laid to rest. He turns to George Mcmurtry next to him during the ceremony, and he says, "George, I shouldn't have come." he said, I can't help thinking that's one of my men in that casket, and I'm going to hear their screams in my dreams tonight. And a short time later, he boards a steamer bound for Cuba, where he has no business. And as the steamer makes its way across the Caribbean, he writes some notes. He leaves them for people like Mcmurtry, and then walks out and steps overboard, and he's lost because he just felt this guilt within himself, that he blamed himself for everything, and it broke him. Eventually, it just totally broke him. And this is certainly one journey that I think we see repeated today for many veterans of Iraq and Afghanistan. Before I talk about Alvin York, George Mcmurtry bears his own scars, his own demons, and he breaks up from his wife. His personality has changed. He's very difficult to get along with. But what he finds that holds him together is absolute dedication to the Lost Battalion Survivors Association, which he attends every year for the remainder of his life, and he dies in the 1950s. And at the end of every meeting of the Survivors Association, he lifts up a glass and offers a toast to Charles Whittlesey, calling back to something Whittlesey had said as they watched the remainder of the men under them walk out of the pocket, when he said, "George, we will never be in finer company than we are today." So Mcmurtry will repeat that. He finds a middle ground. He's able to keep body and soul together, but it's tough. For me, Alvin York is a truly uplifting story. And in many ways, I think the key to York's heroism is something that we see in his action in the Argonne on October 8th, 1918, but I think we may see even more in what he did after the war. In that he took all the celebrity that was given to him, the movie with Gary Cooper, the 2 books that were written about him, the money that was given to him, and he says, every penny that I take will go toward helping the people of East Tennessee, helping the people of Fentress County, and the Alvin York Institute, as it's eventually formed, is something he totally dedicates himself to. And if you look in York's story, you see that it's transformative for him. He is able, through his faith, but also his dedication to others, to find a way forward, and to offer an example for veterans today that I think remains incredibly powerful. That this is one way forward, and he's able to find peace. I had the honor of meeting his son Andrew, as well as his grandson Gerald, his great granddaughter, other members of his family in East Tennessee a couple of years ago, and they reflect the peace and the joy that he was able eventually to find. And that, to me, is one of the great stories of the Lost Battalion, of the United States in World War I. This is a picture of the plane that carried the ashes of Damon Runyon over New York City when he died in 1946. He asked Eddie Rickenbacker, his friend, to pour his ashes out of New York City. The city, as he said, that has given so much to me and which I have loved so well. I think he was in that act trying to pull together the stories, the experiences of World War I, the city and the people, and to show how they were all part of a greater whole. And so I thank you for your attention, and Lisa, I look forward to talking with you.
Well, my goodness, thank you, Ed. What a pleasure it is to have you here with us this evening. I'm so glad that you were able to join us, and I want to thank all of our listeners who are with us this evening. Like you, I am passionate about World War I and the stories of the Mcmurtry, and you certainly have a talent, Ed, for bringing them alive. I mean, many of us here in Tennessee know the story of Alvin York, and it doesn't really come alive. It doesn't really take shape until we understand the context. And I think that's what you do so well. We get a larger picture from your book, and to me, that's such a treasure. And um, we wouldn't have a story, it seems, without each of the four men playing his role in this. Wouldn't you agree?
Yeah, totally. And it's interesting how they come from very different backgrounds, and then their stories intersect and converge at this one moment.
Right. And it seems to me that you have a way, in addition to bringing the finer details into this genre of telling history, but doing it in a sort of, if I may, popularized voice. But you don't mince words, I notice. You speak about men being blown to tiny pieces and the macabre wall of corpses that men hid behind for protection. And I mean, many that may offend some people, but I guess that brings it to home exactly what these men were dealing with, correct?
And that was deliberate. I think the story of World War I is, and America's participation, is an incredibly human story. And what I tried to show in Never in Finer Company, there are dark aspects, but there are also uplifting aspects. And the uplifting aspects are what some men were able to do with what they experienced, York being an example of that. One of the things that struck me when I wrote an earlier book, To Conquer Hell, about the Mizargon, I was reading some veterans' accounts, and one veteran's reminiscence was, it just really hit me in the head like a 2x4. He said, you know, everybody said that when we came home that we didn't want to talk about what we experienced. And he said this is not true. He said we wanted to talk, but they didn't want to listen. That we would start to try to talk about what we felt, what we were feeling, and they would shut us off. They'd say, that's just too awful to talk about. Let's talk about something else. And I felt like something of a mission that these stories must be told, and we have to listen, no matter how difficult they may be. And honestly, Lisa, I think I may have told you some of these. It made some people really mad, you know, that these stories were being told. It astonished me that some people would be angry that I would be telling some of these veteran stories because they didn't want to hear it. But that says more about us than about them, I think.
Would you say that Damon Runyon, the journalist, was totally responsible for bringing this story to Americans, pretty much as another journalist did with the Alvin York story?
Yes, Damon Runyon was in many ways responsible for it, being the first one to interview them. But the thing about Runyon, and I have tremendous admiration for him, Runyon was utterly dedicated to the individual story, and he was dedicated to telling it honestly. He definitely, in his language, they called it Runyon-esque. It was a word that was invented, you know, to describe Runyon's style of writing. It was very flamboyant, but the core of what he told was true. And what he wanted to tell was the diversity and the reality of the human experience in warfare, and to knit that together with the experience of New York City. He absolutely loved New York City, but he loved the incredible array, the incredible array of characters that you find in New York. You go to a ball game, he'd write about, you know, the peanut vendors and the cops and the baseball players and the odd guys who were watching from the stadium. He loved to knit those together, and I think he brought that to how he chronicled the Lost Battalion, and he wrote about York too later on. And I think he made their stories more immediate and more real for everyday Americans.
I noticed that you talk about New York a lot, and I guess I didn't pick that up when I read the book, but it also hasn't escaped my notice, and maybe other readers, the parallels with 9/11 and the fact that this was the explosion. I think it was the Black Tom explosion in New York Harbor. It seems to me that there are parallels with the attack on the Trade Center. and both triggered cataclysmic results. Is that reading too much into this, Ed?
You know, 9/11 was on my mind when I wrote
Was
about
it?
New York City. You know, I was thinking about it. I tried not to let it define what I was writing, but I think there are parallels. The Black Tom explosion being in late 1916 was a result of German sabotage, though it wasn't known at the time. Exploded right near the Statue of Liberty and killed a number of people, sent shockwaves through the city because it was such a massive explosion. Shrapnel rained down on the Statue of Liberty. Some damage, I believe, is still visible today. The interesting thing, the story of New York, just again in a nutshell, I didn't have time to go into it, I say in the book. In 1917, when the first parades take place, there's this kind of apathy that really worries the media, that people are not showing much patriotism, they don't seem invested in the war, and there's this tremendous worry that there's something wrong with New York. It's because of all these immigrants, you know, that they're not showing this passion and dedication. When they join the 77th and other divisions, and many of them in the 82nd as well, and they go off to fight, and people like Damon Runyon, but especially Damon Runyon, tell their story as a New York story. He's writing his articles back to people in New York saying, here's what your boys are doing right now. All these really wildly different people, they're fighting for your city. And when they come back, one symbol that kind of, maybe it's schlocky, but it brought tears to my eyes, in a New York newspaper shows one of these troop ships coming home and the Statue of Liberty reaching out to embrace them. And then when they're paraded through New York City, the whole city turns out with tremendous love. And they feel like we're part of this country now. We have an identity. And our diversity is part of our story, but it's an American story. And I find that really powerful.
So do I. And despite the passage of time, there are similarities there more than we realize, aren't there?
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah. Rachel, do we have time for more questions, or do we want to turn this over to our audience?
We have gotten quite a few audience questions, so I'll leave that to you, Lisa. Do you want to go a few more minutes and then I can take over?
All right. I have one more question that, as a writer, I can't help but ask. That's the level of detail that you approach the story with. Again, it's such a compelling account of the action in October 1918. But it amazes me as I'm reading it. I read such details, such as, let's see, how did he know that Jeremy, and you might want to say something about the pigeon, flew into that tree? Or how did he know that Major Whittlesey had a nosebleed as he was writing the message? And would you say that you've taken some poetic license here, or as a historian, can you show evidence of these details that bring the human aspect out?
I think in a book like this, everything that I wrote, I think is backed up by evidence, but at times it helps to speculate and wonder what they were thinking, what was going through their minds, because you have to present their humanity and their individuality. It's something an academic historian would say, oh my gosh, you can't speculate. Thinking.
Not this one.
To me, there's nothing wrong with that in a book that's intended to connect with everyday people, and I'm a humanistic historian. That's how I view myself. I think the story of humanity is the story of us. It's who we are. And that, to me, the fascination is in the humanity. It's not so much in the details, but we all learn from writers who are better than we are and historians who are better than we are. One of the people I look up to, who's a much better writer than me, and is very successful, deservedly so, is Rick Atkinson. And Rick is
very much.
Rick is great. I mean, he's not a trained historian, but dang it, I mean, that guy is an archive hound. He backs up everything he says with evidence. But the way he writes, he's able to employ those details, not in a boring way, but in a compelling way at certain moments. So I think, imitation is the sincerest form of flattery. And
there you go.
Imitate what
Well,
Rick does.
I'd say it definitely works. And I wouldn't be surprised. You did mention the source of controversy over the exact spot where the York action happened. And I leave it open to you if you want to make a comment about that. But you do say in your book that Doug Mastriano's book was the key. It was a very valuable source for you. And if you want to address that, then I leave that to your discussion.
Well, Doug Mastriano's biography of Alvin York that came out many years ago with University Press of Kentucky is the first full modern biography of York. And in that sense, I think it's invaluable because the two previous biographies of York are partly and possibly largely fictionalized. The ones that were done in the one in the 20s, one in the 30s, I can't remember their publication dates, and the second one by Scahill became the basis of the movie. It has this fake hillbilly dialect in it, and it's really an awful, awful book. I give Mastriano credit for attempting a modern biography, and many of the things that he says are useful. In that sense, it also has a lot of errors in it. So you have to be careful. For example, he repeats the old story that York had a ticker tape parade in New York City. Well, he didn't. And it's all you have to do is look at the newspapers to see that. But there are other more serious errors. And Mastriano launched an effort some years ago to try to identify the site of Alvin York's action. He was able to convince a local French mayor and other authorities to build the Alvin York Trail, where the combat supposedly took place, and ironically paved over part of the battlefield to build the trail. And I think it's completely wrong. I see no evidence that that is the correct site. Other teams working in a more scholarly manner to really investigate the ground have found what I believe is the correct site, or close to the correct site of the action. And I've walked there, I've seen it, but it's not marked. So now you have everybody who visits, they see the trail and they think they're seeing where York fought, but they're not. And that's a big problem. I honestly think that trail should be removed.
Right. Yeah, I've seen that as well as the ravine, and it just makes you wonder how any of this could have ever taken place, how humans could have survived such an ordeal. But I'd love to go on asking you more questions, Ed, but I'm going to turn it over to our audience. And thank you again for this wonderful book, this compelling story. And I'm sure all of our readers, if they haven't read it, will want to read it after hearing this talk tonight. Thank you. Rachel?
Yes, I agree. And I'm thrilled the audience that is here has great questions and thoughtful questions. So let's get into some of them. One of our first asked, besides Major Whittlesey, who obviously grappled with it, to what degree do you perceive that Mcmurtry or his fellow veterans, such as Alvin C. York, dealt with PTSD or shell shock? He went on to say you mostly answered that, but I wanted to see if you wanted to elaborate a little further.
Yeah, it's clear to me, post-traumatic stress, that Whittlesey, Mcmurtry, and York all suffered from it. And that was one of my major themes, was how did they deal with this? What did they do with it? Because I think it's incredibly relevant. It's clear also that many, many others who were in that pocket also dealt with serious post-traumatic stress. And Whittlesey, one of the things that breaks him eventually is that after the war is over, these guys keep coming to Whittlesey saying, I can't stop drinking, or I can't hold down a job, or I'm having these nightmares. What do I do? And Whittlesey keeps trying to help him. He keeps giving everything he can to help him, and eventually he sinks under it. The Lost Battalion Survivors Association is an important story in that World War I veterans coming home received no significant government help, and no government help at all respecting their mental trauma. And they were just told, you have to go back to work. You're just going to have to deal with it. But the one resource they did have was these survivors associations, was each other. The Lost Battalion Survivor Association being one of them, that these guys could come together, and they did. They were totally dedicated, and many other units had the same thing, year after year after year, and they'd write to each other and they'd say, here's what I'm dealing with, and they'd help each other out. I think that's an important story.
All right. The next question is long, so bear with me for one moment. He says that he's read Lisa's Bodies of War. He's read Ed's Never in Finer Company, is a doctoral candidate, and is doing research. And he's asking, did Germany, he said he learned that Germany did a lot of sabotage prior to the US entry into World War I, especially New Jersey. I also learned that the British broke Germany's code books. Did Pershing know this? And any suggestions on the best way to research that topic?
There have been a couple of books about the Black Tom, and I can't remember the titles off the top of my head, but if you look for them on Amazon or WorldCat, you can find them. Black Tom, and it's kind of funny actually, given all the sabotage paranoia that hit the country after we entered the war in April. We thought there were spies everywhere. In one case, a janitor was arrested for going into a basement with a wrench in his hand because they thought he was going to sabotage the building because he was from Germany as an immigrant. The Black Tom was not known to have been an active German sabotage until after the war. And even Woodrow Wilson wasn't aware until many, many months had passed. So Pershing was not aware of that. There were some other acts of German sabotage, but Pershing was generally aware that some of that was going on, but he couldn't put his finger on exactly what they had done. I wouldn't say there was a lot of sabotage. Black Tom was by far the most spectacular, but there was some. On the story of the breaking of the codes relating to the Zimmerman telegram, that's a very interesting story. Don't have the time to go into the details here, but there have been a couple of very good books recently about the Zimmerman telegram, and the British having intercepted the codes. The British had also were spying on us and supplied us with information about the telegram, which was very convenient for them. But it also happened to be true. So that's an interesting story.
They are still coming, so I got to move faster here. Yeah. We got lots of good questions. We got a question about kind of the historiography of York's story that you mentioned, kind of the questionable histories of Cohen, and the York's own recollection of false memories, such as his return to the battle site the next day. How do we properly use questionable sources like these in history?
That's a great question. It's something I really struggled with York, is that we have to, every person who's written about York, you have to use the York diary, and you have to use the volume by Scahill, because it's hard to find primary source material directly from York about what he was saying. And so you have to use this fake hillbilly stuff, these fake hillbilly quotes, like "I tetched him off." And it's irritating. The best thing you can do, if you need to use them really carefully, you need to recognize the possibility that some of this stuff is made up, and you need to supplement them with other sources. So for example, with York in this book, I tried as much as possible to read newspaper interviews with him, where reporters talked to him after he came home, and the accounts that he gave there, I thought were really useful. There was also a great interview with Charles Whittlesey that I discovered, that a Seattle Post newspaper reporter of all people found Whittlesey at home with his mother and talked to him about what he experienced, and it was super powerful. So look for those sources.
We got a question about, it's kind of a two-part question. She's referencing the story about an officer with his leg swollen double. And I think she's asking if that was gangrene and how did soldiers survive without antibiotics?
Oh gosh, many of them didn't survive, and this was something that these guys in the Lost Battalion were dealing with. They had no medical supplies at all, so they couldn't disinfect. Um, the discovery of penicillin will make a huge difference later on in treating the wounded. But for one example of this, some of these guys are developing gangrene. The one officer is a Lieutenant Maurice Wren in the Lost Battalion. He's a guy who is like he's worked on Broadway, and he's hoping to go work in the movie industry after the war, but he's had part of his foot blown off, and he's sitting in a shell hole day after day, feeling the infection growing. And he's the one guy who says, well, maybe we should surrender, and brings this to Whittlesey. And Whittlesey handles it with great humanity. He tells him, we're not going to talk about surrender. You keep holding on. But he also doesn't condemn him. Other people will condemn Wren later on, people sitting at home comfortably in their rooms and say, well, he was talking about surrender. What a coward. Well, when you feel gangrene going through your body and you're in agony and you see no prospect of relief, who among us can't say we would want to do the same thing?
Absolutely. I've got two more. Is that okay, Ed?
Absolutely.
All right. These are good.
Yes.
Did the present day situation of immigrants serve as an impetus for writing this story?
It's also a great question. It wasn't an impetus. It wasn't the reason I wrote the book. My primary impetus was to look at how men deal with trauma. And I have to say that's going to be probably motivating everything I write for the remainder of my career, because to me it's been an undercurrent of everything I've written about in the past, and it's becoming more and more stark to me. How did Whittlesey, Mcmurtry, and York deal with their trauma, and how did the paths that they take, how are they important today? I thought as I was writing it, I found the story of the New York City immigrants and their struggle for meaning and identity to have some modern day parallels. I did not want to force those parallels, and I don't think they should be forced. But this was a period in our history when immigration had totally transformed the country, and I think it's fascinating that these immigrants were so determined to show that they were Americans, and that they in many ways fought with greater dedication and passion than natural born American citizens in combat. And I think that's pretty compelling as well.
Absolutely. All right, our last one. Alvin York became a significant supporter of the effort in World War II, and he had previously not allowed his fame to be used in that fashion. What might you say about York's World War II and post-World War II public persona?
Yeah, that's one of, for York biographers as well as York family members, I think that's a tough part of his life to handle. York was a very dedicated patriot. He became more so as his life continued. Obviously, there's nothing wrong with that. That's to his favor. It's something that was a contrast to how he had grown up in a very isolated way. It's interesting when one of the parts of the York story early on that does not come out is that he said to one of his officers, at one moment he said, "I've resolved in my mind the issue of killing if I have to in combat, but I just want to understand, what is this all about? Why are we even fighting here?" And that's the young Alvin York trying to figure out, why are we in this war? What does this have to do with the Upper Cumberland and my life in Fentress County? After the war, he is sent all over the country on all these speaking junkets. and he's lionized, and he becomes part of the national scene. And I think he begins to develop a more national vision. He is very proud of the movie Sergeant York, even though I think he knows deep down a lot of it is not true. But he loved Gary Cooper, and he just thought it was a great movie. And he felt that if it would help his country, if it would help to prepare their country better than they were prepared in 1917, then that would be all to the good. Some of the things that he says later in his life, if you go, in post-World War II, his views get a little bit extreme on some things. And he's got a lot of feelings. There's a lot of things he's dealing with. He's dealing with health issues. And he's trying to find his own path, and he goes off he goes off the deep end a few times, but I think we can forgive him for that, because of his great dedication to his family and to his country. It was never in question.
Awesome. That's a good way to end it. And we did get through all our questions, so thank you so much. Thank you so much for being here. This was such a fantastic program. Lisa, thank you for bringing these great questions yourself. It's just been a joy. And we will have this up on our website if anybody wants to share it with friends later. And for our participants, thank you all so much for spending your evening with us. I did link a really short survey in our chat bar. If you don't mind filling that out, that would help us greatly. And if you have any last questions, feel free to shoot them to me in the chat bar, but otherwise, have a great night. Thank you guys so much again.
Thank you. Hope to see you in Nashville soon, Ed and Rachel. Don't forget to remind our visitors that we have the Alvin York materials on display in the new museum. So good night.
Yes, absolutely. Come see all of Alvin York's paraphernalia. Absolutely.
Good night.
All right, night. Bye-bye.
Thanks, Rachel.